We are drafting at Underdog in the Little Big Board 2. We are pretty much on 1 week away from the NFL draft. This is at 65% full. It will be getting into that period of time now where it's your last chance to do some of the pre-NFL drafts. So we are jumping in this one. If you want to play over at Underdog Fantasy, you can use the promo code RotoViz to get yourself a 100% sign-up bonus up to $100. We were waiting on one place to come in here. It is now full. Shawn, we're right in the middle of the board, the 106 slot. So looking forward to seeing how we move here and what has changed maybe from when we did the drafts a couple of weeks ago and how the landscape is possibly changing before the NFL draft. You did some great shows along with Ben Gretsch for Stealing Bananas over the last week or so, looking at some of the offenses where free agency or even the trade of Stephon Diggs has maybe muddied the waters, maybe created opportunities for draft value in terms of the ADP. So lots of good conversation there. But the 106, how are you feeling as we get there right in the middle of the board? I know we joke that we like to get picks that are kind of in the mid-range because it allows us to talk between picks. But outside of that, how do you feel about the 106?
Good. It gives us a shot at one of the big name players in the first round. One of the things that we talked about on those shows is that the first round is fairly solid, but I do think that once Amon-Ra is gone, and then for me, it's quite a bit weaker. So I'd like to be above that spot, which we are now. The other thing that allows us to do is to grab these values as they fall throughout the draft, maybe not be as pressured as well to reach for someone we think is a key part of our build. Being in the middle has a lot of benefits. Colm, let's see if we can execute.
Yeah, let's see if we can. The most recent draft we did together was a draft where we went with Justin Jefferson at the slot when he was available. We did have some discussion after that then with the quarterback scenarios and how that could play out. We talked through Amon-Ra, Puka, for example, AJ Brown as potential alternatives. Jamar Chase is somebody maybe you're hoping that falls to you at that point. He doesn't. So Chase goes, Jefferson goes. That sets us up, Shawn, with I think a pretty clear St. Brown Nakua discussion. Have you a preference there?
Yeah, I think that Amon-Ra is a pretty easy pick if we're not going to go with the two running backs there in Bijan and Breece Hall, who are the two top players by ADP. Anybody who wants to work through that discussion, Pat and I talked about it at great detail on his legendary Upside podcast. Colm, you didn't act like you gave any consideration to the two running backs there. Is that how you're wanting to do that in all of your drafts?
Pretty much so far. That's the way I'm trying to play it. And another thing that you and Ben, I believe, discussed on Stealing Bananas was the running backs that become available, later this year again. We're obviously partial to a bit of zero RB drafting, but the wide receivers available through this range and to try and have, 4 of those through the opening 5 rounds is kind of my goal here so far. But 2 players you could obviously deviate to do that for would be Breece Hall or Bijan Robinson. Obviously, if Christian McCaffrey up there in the first 2 picks as well as a potential option. So for me, it is the the wide receivers. But if it got to a point where you're at, say, the 108 and the options that have gone, Breece would come into consideration there for me, probably ahead of Bijan. But Puka goes at the 109, who I would still have ahead of the 2 running backs. So until Brown and Nakua go, I think I'm still looking to get one of those top-end wide receivers, in my opinion there.
Now, what are you thinking as we wrap back into round 2? We do see that the next couple of picks were the running backs, then Puka, Gibbs, AJ Brown. One of the things that's interesting there, AJ Brown over the second half of last season did get crushed by Devontae Smith. And I'm not saying I expect that to be the case over the full season, or I expect that to be a changing of the guard there for the Eagles. But I do think those 2 players should be closer together in ADP. We get the contract extension for Devontae Smith. That I think is probably exploitable right now. I think that we will see that ADP change. I think you're going to see Garrett Wilson above those guys. The next player off the board then is Saquon Barkley. He's somebody a lot lower in my rankings. I think it's surprising to get him up there. There are some limitations to his scoring profile that probably don't justify that pick. It's especially difficult for me to understand how players like Saquon Barkley and Devontae Adams can go here ahead of Kyren Williams, who is still available. Colm, as we race toward our pick in round 2, what are you seeing as possibilities?
So this is where it gets a little bit tricky, and having the tools pulled up over on RotoViz to see the ADP over the last 2 weeks Marvin Harrison is obviously going there. Drake London would be who I would kind of like to get here. Some of the players then that are in this range are who you and Ben talked about: Nico Collins, DJ Moore, Stephon Diggs, and those for me are challenging at the second round prices. Although I like them all individually, I think there's alternative options later on. We are one pick away. We're going to have an opportunity to get London or Harrison. I think I would prefer Drake London here if that was the possible option, if he is there and Harrison's there. But out of these names that are available, for me, it's London, Harrison. But the other one name that I would be hoping would maybe potentially sneak back to us in the next round, but is going at the 301 in ADP at the moment, and that is Chris Olave, who I think may be getting a little bit overlooked with potential. Although last season maybe didn't hit the heights that we hoped going into it, still a serviceable year from him. So Drake London is available. Harrison goes at the 206. We get London at the 207. How do you feel there, Shawn? Would London be your preferred option? And then Olave, who I mentioned, how are you feeling about him so far? We haven't really talked about him at all.
Yeah, I think that probably in a vacuum is how I would like it. I guess in this case, when you're thinking about where Harrison is going at about the 203, if he had fallen to us at the 207, I probably would jump on that. I mean, Drake London only a couple of picks less expensive. I do think that London is a lot safer. You're going to get him with one of these quarterbacks in Kirk Cousins, who supports fantasy wide receivers at a very high level. I do think that it's very likely that Marvin Harrison is going to be a much better overall player than Drake London. And I think that one of the things that has continued to develop over the last several years is that you can see that right away. And so it's early in the second round to take Marvin Harrison. Again, not to flog these too much, but Ben and I had some really good content, I think, on how we're valuing Harrison and neighbors, what we think the concerns are, what we think the upside happens to be. And yet, at that price, I don't know, the upside there for Harrison does get me pretty excited. Whereas, I mean, for me, Drake London is like a pure compromise pick in the middle of round 2. You've got a guy who didn't do too much through 2 seasons, did just enough in what was a bad environment to justify people taking a shot on him again. But in the middle of round 2, I mean, that's the play that you want. Now, again, when you look at the other options there, I do think it's the play that makes sense, but it's not something that you get very fired up about. So from that perspective, I would have appreciated us being able to make a more fun pick in round 2. But Colm, I think that gives us the right structural selection. Now, heading back into round 3 here, and we're on the clock already. Mike Evans, Josh Allen, Michael Pittman, Sam LaPorta. Colm, I've got a sense of who you might want to just go ahead and go with. Who's our pick?
Well, the option here, I think you're thinking for me, is LaPorta. The other option I would put out there would be Devontae Smith or potentially Cooper Kupp, but I think we could hope that maybe one of them comes back. I don't think LaPorta comes back, but is that who you wanted? I love when you set them up, and I think that is the way you probably play it. But we did have some discussions last year where I was very high on TJ Hawkinson at this time last year, probably in a similar way to I am with Sam LaPorta. But in some of these drafts, that was kind of a tipping point for you and me on strategy of where to take that particular player. How are you feeling at the 306 with LaPorta? And again, I know when we're drafting these, we're hoping that some of these players might slide their way through. I think both of those wide receivers will also be gone in the mid-4th, but I thought there's no chance that LaPorta sneaks back around. So, and I want to defend the London pick, not an exciting pick, but you mentioned about Kirk Cousins and how much he has been very helpful to wide receivers. Part of that also is that the wide receiver he's very helpful to is Justin Jefferson, who potentially could go on to be one of the best wide receivers of all time. But Marvin Harrison, with his, I guess, lineage, with what he has shown in college, the upside for him is to be up there with the likes of a Jamar Chase or a Justin Jefferson, where that mightn't be the case for London. But if we're looking directly for 2024, I think there's the potential for him to kind of play off what has happened with Cousins and Jefferson over the years. But more so on LaPorta, and Kupp obviously has gone, and Devontae Smith has gone since. Who would have been your preferred option out of those 3?
Well, LaPorta is the one that I wanted. I have him at the 209. Now, one of the things that you have to, balance here in Underdog is that you are going to get shots at some of the other tight ends. So it doesn't have to be the same guy every time. But when we do have a situation in the middle of round 3 where, again, the wide receiver selections are maybe a little bit underwhelming. The fun thing here is that 4, 5, 6, the wide receiver selections, should seem like they have quite a bit of upside. So, if we have to pass on one there, come back, take the ones who have the ability to smash ADP and have Sam LaPorta as opposed to having a little bit lower, I'd say lower upside and also lower floor tight end. The other thing that this does is set us up for one of those Detroit Lions centric teams.
And just for people listening in, the one player I really did want to get if he would have came those 3 extra picks is Waddle. Sam LaPorta versus Waddle. Who would you take in that situation?
Yeah, I think you've got to take Waddle because he's going to get more expensive. So you would have selected him. You set yourself up for one of these additional tight ends. Travis Kelce makes it to us in the middle of the 4th round. I'm not as high on him, but obviously that is a decent selection. Colm, we're now on the clock in round 4. This is T. Higgins or Zay Flowers for me. Do you have a different option?
They're the 2 options that I would be going for here. Obviously, Rome Odunze's in this exact range, but I'll let you pick this, Shawn. I'm finding it impossible. You've picked T. Higgins. I'm finding it impossible to pick between the 2, and I do think I have a bias towards T. Higgins. So I was letting you make the choice. So we take T. Higgins over Zay Flowers. Again, there is a 4 to 5 pick range in ADP between the 2 of those wide receivers. And because we're a pick 6, a lot of these players that I'm going to mention that they may slide through, they're not going to slide through in these situations because of the 12 picks. But if you were picking, 2 or 3 picks closer to the turn, much more realistic for those players to slide through from a drafting perspective. I mentioned Rome Odunze, Shawn. I hadn't seen it pop up on my screen here at the time that you asked me, but he did go 1 pick ahead of us at the 42nd pick. Rashee Rice still going in the 45th pick. I know Ben mentioned him on Stealing Bananas, but obviously lots of stuff coming out. Very hard to speculate on. Probably will seem like maybe a 2-game suspension coming his way, but the 4th round's probably, we had a draft a couple of weeks ago before that all came out where we took him in the 2nd round. Lots of questions around that, but I think if you're missing 2 weeks, Shawn, a 2-round discount in ADP is still relevant. We don't know what the team's going to make of his actions in that particular situation, so that's something to talk about another day down the line. But is he somebody who would be like, off a draft board for you, or in the late 4th? Is he somebody you take under consideration?
He's off the board for me at these prices because you just don't know. If it ends up being 2 games, then you're all set. He does deserve to go around the 1-2 turn. I mean, would you prefer to have him over Saquon Barkley? Obviously. Would you prefer to have him over Devontae Adams? Obviously. And yet, I think there are scenarios in which he misses the entire season. I think you've got to be pretty concerned about Rashee Rice right now. But the main thing is you just don't know. And there are plenty of other guys with good profiles here that I don't think there's any huge necessity to go ahead and select Rice during this portion of the draft season. Colm, we do see Zay Flowers go there at the 502. That is disappointing. Your Green Bay Packers player in Jayden Reed is someone who might be available to us here in the middle of round 5. But also this is an opportunity for us to start grabbing these tight ends as we look through the different options. Kenneth Walker, a chance for us to get on the board at running back. Kincaid,
how do you feel,
the
Shawn,
last pick in round 5. Kyle Pitts, early 6. George Kittle, middle 6. And Kenneth Walker, early 6. All the guys that I'm really looking at here, Colm, other than Jayden Reed, are round 6 players. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I think Reed is the wide receiver if we go in that direction. The other wide receiver I do like, who you've added to the queue, is Addison, but it's usually kind of in that next round range, mid to late 6th. The question I was going to have then is, it comes to, well, Mark Andrews went off the board. It comes to the option then for potentially to go with Kyle Pitts and to look towards the Atlanta Falcons to stack things up. The running back of interest, as you mentioned, is Kenneth Walker. I think I would go with Reed here on this one and then see if Pitts comes back to us.
Okay, so we'll add Jayden Reed. We now have Amon-Ra, Drake London, T. Higgins, Jayden Reed with Sam LaPorta. That's exactly what we're looking for in terms of the build at this juncture. Colm, if
that's the first running back for people. That's the first running back I felt like potentially. Ben uses the word detour, and I always love when he says it, but that was the first running back I thought serious consideration about taking there.
Yeah, and hopefully either Kenneth Walker or Kyle Pitts make it back. Dalton Kincaid, I don't think will, but would also be an interesting selection. If we were able to get a couple Lions and a couple of Falcons, ideally that would push down the prices on guys like Kirk Cousins and Jared Goff. One of the things that is interesting about this particular draft is that the two top players available by ADP are Patrick Mahomes and CJ Stroud. CJ Stroud does go at pick. Patrick Mahomes goes at pick 60, about 9 spots below ADP. You occasionally get these dips, and then that doesn't manifest all the way through. And yet I do think there's a possibility that quarterbacks will not be that expensive in this particular draft. Unfortunately, Kyle Pitts goes at 61. Kenneth Walker still available. If he goes, Colm, then we're into this next group of Jordan Addison, Jackson Smith and Jigba, Brock Bowers, and Kenneth Walker does go. So we aren't going to get any of our targets at this point. Any regrets on Jayden Reed, and who do you want to see us take in round 6?
I'm going to hope that we get Jordan Addison in one's picks time. 4th by ADP here. The players available, Joe Mixon, Kamara, Kittle. Then we're into Addison, Aaron Jones, Deontay Johnson. I would like to get Addison, and then I think we start to move into that direction towards some of the potential running back names. Disappointing now that we didn't get either of the guys back that we had talked about there, but I think it's still setting up very, very interestingly so far here for this draft. I have to say, Shawn, it is a 0 RB draft so far, but we'll see what happens now through the next 10 picks and how things start to play out there. But you did mention, when I said about Pitts, you also mentioned about Wave St. Brown and Sam LaPorta should open up the opportunities maybe to get a little bit of a potential discount on Jared Goff with this roster as well. But yeah, I was hoping that Kenneth Walker would have got back. You asked me about any regrets. We'll see when the draft is over, but there is a lot of potential with this team at the moment that Kenneth Walker, who went to pick 64 versus Jayden Reed at 54, and then having Addison make it back to us, that at the end of this draft, that may have been the optimum way to play it. But these drafts sometimes play out in ways that fall favorably to you when you're getting some of your targets in the 8 through 12 range as well. So we'll see. We may be completely locked out at the running back position, and then that will look like a disastrous decision.
Yeah, I don't think that losing the running back is a big problem. I think potentially losing the tight end could be not more damaging, but just one that we regret a little bit more. And yet that's, again, one of the reasons why it's so valuable to have Sam LaPorta there.
Something that we did earlier in draft season was we went with, 2 kind of top end tight ends. And I think we had Sam LaPorta and Trey McBride maybe in a couple of teams, and teams with that kind of dynamic, getting 2 tight ends early. Is that something that you've continued to try and do throughout draft season, or is that just in certain drafts that you're looking that way to try and have 2 as early as we're discussing there?
No, I'd like to have 2 early every time. I think that there's a massive tier break once Evan Ingram and David Njoku are gone. And I would argue that there's probably a meaningful tier break that's not priced quite correctly before Evan Ingram and David Njoku go, with Brock Bowers on the right side of it. Now, there's obviously a lot more projection in that. There's obviously a lot more risk in that. But Bowers, such a massive prospect. I'm going to have an article out on him in the next week at the very least, as the NFL draft is right around the corner. But it will be part of the series where I discuss the 6 guys who I think are viable as the Superflex 101. He's definitely in there. And I think he's a guy who's going to end up rising. I think he's going to be more expensive than this. When you look at the prices on a Marvin Harrison, on a Malik Neighbors, it doesn't make sense having Brock Bowers where he is. Now, Colm, unfortunately, Bowers and JSN go in the 2 picks right ahead of us. We can take Ingram, or we could do something we haven't really discussed and take Joe Burrow to go with T. Higgins.
If you want to take Burrow, that's okay. I probably would go with Evan Ingram, but I know after that, we're the only tight end really that we're looking to get would be Njoku, and if he doesn't go in between, it's going to be a little bit of a tricky situation. But Shawn wanted to go with the Burrow side, which I think is a very fair pick. We'll see again how it plays out. I like to have a little bit of back and forth with these, where I kind of think I may have overrid Shawn on the Walker pick, and we get it there. So Burrow along with Higgins, and Shawn, you have to think back to obviously that last season didn't go the way that the Bengals or Burrow himself would have wanted, or fans or fantasy managers would have wanted. But the difference in price from T. Higgins, Joe Burrow, to combine those 2 players in best ball drafts, let's say last season or 2 seasons ago, there is a huge discount factored in to those 2 players from where they were going at that particular time, which, all things considered, doesn't feel justified.
Yeah, it depends a little bit on exactly what your overall quarterback approach is. I don't really plan to take much Joe Burrow, but when he's this inexpensive and then he's also below ADP, and Jake Bose had some good research out last year suggesting that the QB ADP values were not nearly as meaningful in terms of helping with advance rate and that type of thing as running back and wide receiver ADPs. I think that makes sense, right? And yet, if you're going to get a player who fits at those prices when you didn't have any other player that you felt was a must draft, that's when I like to go ahead and do it. The situation for us there is that, Evan Ingram, when we have Sam LaPorta, is probably a little bit of a compromise pick. And for me, you're going to have quite a few teams that do set up to be Jared Goff, and I don't want to be like that heavy Jared Goff. I don't have any problem having a decent exposure, but you want to keep from having him in every draft. The same thing is, vaguely going to be true of a Kirk Cousins. And then Colm, for me, I think you have to have a lot of Jayden Daniels and have to have a lot of Justin Fields. And again, even with that being the case and those guys being easy to draft because you don't necessarily have to stack them up as heavily, and because right now they're just still so discounted, again, do you want to end up with monster exposures? Probably not. So when the draft gives you someone as good as Joe Burrow, and it makes sense, I think that's when you go ahead and pull the trigger so that you manage your exposures that way, as opposed to forcing it at other times when you look back on it later and just feel like you wish you'd done something different. So we're on the clock. David Njoku, Jaylen Warren, Colm, back to you for this pick.
I'd probably go Warren, but if you want to go Njoku, that's fine.
So we will go ahead and take
the running back.
I probably
pinch,
would have taken Njoku, in part because I have just an absolute ton of Warren. And Njoku is that kind of last tight end that I'm trying to get as the tight end too. But Warren does allow us to start making some inroads at the running back position.
Yeah, I was feeling a little bit of a pinch, I think, there for the running back position. And part of that is when you look at the players going in this range, I do like Warren over, like in terms of my targets. In this range, you're looking at Nick Chubb, Javonte Williams, Eckler, Zamir White, Trey Benson. Maybe we'll get some of those that might come back to us. But as you mentioned, when it was trickling down to our pick, Jake Ferguson goes at pick 87, then Pollard, Mike Williams, Nick Chubb. So I was hoping that we were going to have at least one of them make it to us. Both of them made it to us, and it was a tough decision. If we hadn't had LaPorta, obviously would have a stronger urging towards Njoku there, but I think that we can make some inroads at the running back position and try and see what we can potentially put together at tight end. But as you mentioned, Shawn, it does get to quite slim pickings quite quickly from this point forward, and that really does change for me from a potential 2 tight end build to probably a minimum of a 3 tight end build here moving forward. There is 20 rounds in this format because it's pre-draft, so you do have a couple of extra picks to sprinkle in there, but yeah, tight end can be a little bit tricky from this point forward. There is a run, Shawn, here on running backs. Trey Benson, Javonte Williams, Brian Robinson, Zamir White all go off the board. Any options here? Running back that you'd like? It is an area where it tends to lean into running backs. Tyjae Spears still available, who usually though is in the 10th round, which I'd hope that he may come back. But the other options here: Chase Brown, Devin Singletary, Zach Moss by ADP. Any other names outside of an Austin Eckler potentially standing out for you, or is there a different direction to go here?
Yeah, I think you can always take Eckler. I think it'll probably end up being a little bit of a better fit than people are considering. Brooks would probably be the guy that I would select. But the other element here, Colm, I'm going to go ahead and have us take Jared Goff. He would probably fall as opposed to be the pick at the next spot. But because we were kind of running out of time there, it's one of the things of trying to do the show at the same time. Our next pick would have been Goff's ADP.
ADP, yeah.
Right. And we probably would have taken him there to go with Amon-Ra and Sam LaPorta. We have 3 running backs who I like all about the same. And with Jonathan Brooks and Tyjae Spears, they also have ADPs that are more or less right at the next pick. Yeah. And so as opposed to risk losing a Jared Goff, which I don't think was much of a risk at all with us having the main Lions players there. But
realistically, he's probably not coming to the mid 11th. He's probably like, if you passing him in the 10th, you're probably giving yourself a risk of losing him then.
Probably. The thing that did happen here is that the 2 running backs we were looking at
both
as being most interesting in terms of Spears and Brooks did both go, which for me pushes us down to Chase Brown. Now, his ADP is a little bit lower than Zach Moss. It would have been better for us if Moss had been one of the guys who was selected. Call this area not as strong at running back as it is in some seasons. Anybody that you are seeing here that you think is another possible option? I'll pull up the running backs and you can see Moss, Singletary, Brown, Gus Edwards, Chuba, Blake Corum, Zach Charbonnet, Jaylen Wright. Some of those guys will be available to us later, and I don't mind their ADPs at that point.
Yeah, that's kind of what I'm thinking. Chase Brown went. Those players I'm hoping to see in the next round. Chase Brown went off the board as we were just talking there, Shawn, so it does leave us in a little bit of a spot.
Colm, this is a good spot for us to go ahead and take a Dallas Goedert. He's someone I'm not targeting this season, and yet it's very easy to envision a scenario in which this entire Philadelphia Eagles offense bounces back, in which Dallas Goedert is healthier, in which he is part of their solution to unlocking the middle of the field, to unlocking some intermediate passes to help balance what they're doing vertically with A.J. Brown and Devontae Smith. I think we want to be careful about completely forgetting, again, a player like a Dallas Goedert who has so much upside, both from a talent perspective in all likelihood, and then from an offensive perspective, if the Eagles get going again. And I think that betting against the Eagles, generally speaking, might be the way to play the 2024 season. But when you are, again, kind of in that pressured situation where you don't like any of the other selections and you're going to have to make a little bit of a compromise pick at tight end anyway, that's where I think we want to, again, get our exposure. And so this draft has created a couple of different situations in which it allowed us to address player selections and team selections that we might not have otherwise made, but I think are a really good fit for this team.
Yeah, I think it's a good fit and a good pivot to go with Goddard. Was hoping that we would have got Chase Brown there. Likewise, 5 picks away, I'm hoping that Hubbard gets back to us. So again, I think this draft's going to be a fun one to look back on after and see where some of the deviation points, could have changed the dynamics of this team very differently. But we'll see if that is positive or negative, as Hubbard also goes off the board. The running backs, Shawn, all going quite a bit ahead of ADP in this, which again, when we start out this draft, we're kind of, in my envisioning of it anyway, some of those prime targets that we've kind of already discussed on the show but have not been able to get, them all going ahead of ADP is a little bit tricky for us. So we're at pick 124 now at the minute. Some of the players that are in the queue, Charbonnet, Jaylen Wright, Marshawn Lloyd, Kendry Miller. So you mentioned earlier as well, Blake Corum. He is somebody who's available, but it's going to be challenging here with some of the names, Shawn, to fill out the running back queue as things move forward. Jerry Jeudy at wide receiver, but I think we're pretty set up. Colm at tight end. It's going to be a tricky one, but in this particular range, he may become the preferred option for me. Hawkinson's obviously just going to miss a huge chunk of the season. Any of those names, Shawn, standing out for you? Do you want to go to tight end based on how the draft's playing out? It would be about 6 picks ahead of Charbonnet's ADP here.
No, let's go ahead and grab the running back. This is again a situation where you got to look at like 2 rounds together, and we probably want to get both Charbonnet and Wright if possible, which means taking one early and then one, ideally sliding right around to ADP, which has been tough in this particular draft. I think that the situation sort of demands that this time. It is interesting because right after we select Hawkinson and Cole Kmet, both do go. Kmet, somebody who played a big role in the broken ADPs episode of Stealing Bananas, the third of the 3 shorts last week, talking about how he's kind of the forgotten man and the best value of those Chicago Bears passing game weapons. Colm, he's the guy where if we didn't take Goddard, I would have been looking at him at that pick. Again, we would have loved for the pick where we took Goddard to have been the right running back. That didn't transpire. The other thing that's kind of interesting here, the top couple guys by ADP are Kirk Cousins and Jaylen Daniels. So again, I don't think the quarterback decisions have necessarily worked out for us in terms of what then happened later on in the draft. I do think that they were the right picks at the time. But when I'm looking at Cousins, when I'm looking at Daniels, certainly I'd love to have those guys on the team more than I'm dying to get these running backs who are available right here on the team.
This draft, and those quarterbacks as well below ADP at this point as well. So just sometimes the way those jigsaw pieces fit together in drafts can be, all fall for you or all fall against you. This one, Shawn, one that's going a little bit more against us, but it looks like unless this next pick takes right, that we will get him back. A little bit of a QB run with Stafford, Cousins, and Rodgers all going off the board there. Firemouth goes off the board. So we are in a position here right at ADP to take Wright, which I think, pun intended, is the right decision.
So we go ahead and take Jaylen Wright. And one of the things I would recommend there, Colm, Travis May had some cool notes on him. And I say cool, some potential red flags. Make sure that you get in there and listen to his commentary. Right now, there's a 15-pick gap between Wright and Marshawn Lloyd and ADP. I probably actually lean a little bit to Lloyd, but again, because of exposures, I would prefer to play it with Wright first in this one. And obviously there's that possibility that Lloyd comes back to us and we still need running backs. So we're going to kind of work it in that direction. But check out the running back episode with Travis May, one of the most dialed in and informative draft analysts out there. Colm, it's been so much fun having those guys on the show. We're going to have Scott Barrett on next week. I think that everybody who has been on to this point has been fantastic. I've received a lot of really favorable feedback from that. So that's been a lot of fun. What are you thinking about Wright relative to Lloyd? Do you like having Wright here? I mean, obviously we prefer him being more like the running back 5 than the running back 3, but an absolute freak athlete and somebody I think who could back into quite a bit of work. There are teams who need to add at the running back position in this upcoming NFL draft, and that really does push them to someone like a Jaylen Wright.
Yeah, so both of them are interesting. I think, again, and we'll talk about this in a number of different players, I'm sure, throughout the offseason, but based on the profiles and the current ADP, there's about a round discount on Marshawn Lloyd at this particular point. So I think that makes him the easier pick when it comes to between the two, but I will be trying to add both of those in. Now, that will become, I'm saying add both of those in. Once we hit next week and the NFL draft is complete, we'll really know what the situation is based on landing spot and expected outcomes from that. What the NFL draft and what the NFL teams have put into those players in terms of draft capital will show what they believe in those players. So we only have a week of that kind of indecision left, I guess. But in this draft, Shawn, I'm hoping that we can end up with both of them. But in general, it would be towards Lloyd based on the price discount. And I do think there's a few other names. Legit is going in that round. We get Keon Coleman. I can't say that I'm completely out on Jahan Dotson, Shawn. There's still something of me that wants to kind of dip my toes back in there. So there is some other options in the 12th round. And we mentioned some of the quarterbacks, the likes of a Kirk Cousins or Matthew Stafford. There's other options there that are more intriguing to me than when we just drop one round lower and we get into the 13th. So that would be kind of some of the differentiations between the two of those guys. We are one pick away. We're actually on the clock, as I was about to say that. So we do get an option here for Lloyd as well. Is there anyone, after we did that soliloquy, is there anyone that you'd rather take over him?
Well, I think you have to look pretty seriously at Kendre Miller there. He's the other guy along with Bucky Irving. Now, they're two very different types of guys in their own way, but the comparisons of those players to what Kyren Williams did last year, I think, for specific reasons in each case, make them interesting comps. Now, we wouldn't expect anybody to go out and do what Kyren Williams did from his price tag and from just his background going into the season, which is why his price was where it was. But if you're looking at a player who is set up to absolutely smash and massively outperform ADP, I think that Kendre Miller is the guy. Again, it's probably better to go ahead and take Lloyd before the draft here, where he may hit the right spot and jump several rounds, as opposed to Kendre Miller, whose price probably won't be affected by the draft, might even fall, although that is also a little bit difficult for me to see. Now, he does end up going, sadly, at the 13-11. That was something we more or less anticipated there, but I would have loved if he could have come back through. That would have made me feel pretty good about our running back depth chart. Colm, you mentioned Jahan Dotson, which, I mean, I'm kind of out on him except for the Jayden Daniels situation. The thing that I can't even remotely fathom is how Daniels goes in this draft after guys like Aaron Rodgers, Matthew Stafford, even Trevor Lawrence and Justin Herbert. He has no business behind those players. I mean, this guy is a mix between Joe Burrow and Lamar Jackson. I mean, he should be way ahead of where Anthony Richardson was a season ago. And we don't know for sure that's going to be the case. There is still the possibility of landing with the Patriots, which wouldn't be particularly exciting. But you can put him with Jahan Dotson at a cost right now that is very, very easy to manage. So I throw that one in there on your Jahan Dotson note. Now, we're one pick away here. And, I mean, Colm, Marvin Mims, is he going to come back around to us? We just have the 5 wide receivers, and I mean, this is one of our guys. I mean, he was not really in the mix last year, but I have a quarterback late that I like, that I think is going to land on the Denver Broncos, unlock these passing options. I guess I'm pushing for Mims. Are you going to push back here?
No, let's go for it. The other player that I was potentially going to go with there was Tyler Algier, who is in our queue. And Shawn, eventually one of these players are going to fall to us. He is right at ADP now. When we make that selection, we would need him to fall 12 picks. Expectations not very high, but Marvin Mims Jr., Shawn, the new KJ Hamler.
Yeah.
The OG RotoViz Overtime listeners will.
We're just going to call him Hamler Mims and go with it like that.
They'll love a KJ Hamler reference.
I'm sure that Marvin Mims and his family is also excited about that reference. One of the things, Colm, in going back and, or I shouldn't say going back, just working through some of the wide receiver research that's going to come out in the next week, is again blown away by how good of a prospect Mims was in some key areas. He really gets hurt by the fact that Russell Wilson is completely and totally washed. And so there was nothing that they could really do to make that work. Now, that doesn't mean that Mims isn't also a bust. Right, we have to consider that they were very excited about him, and then they're like, oh, well, we had these other guys, so we couldn't work him in. If you're good, you're going to get worked in, and you're going to manage to do some things out there, even with Russell Wilson not being able to throw over the middle, not being able to throw down the field, not being able to throw like any passes at this point that aren't orchestrated little, virtual handoffs. And yet, again, you've got to be aware that rookie season for Mims knocks down his range of outcomes significantly, but when you get in there at pick 163 in the 14th round, behind non-prospects and behind to be honest, other Shawn, players. This is behind the two Chargers wide receivers.
It's outrageous. Like I don't know. We've got to the point now where when if everything isn't perfect after year one, it's like, no, but I don't want him anymore. It's like, well, all the stuff we thought about him last year heading into this season is probably still there with him, and the quarterback, even though there's a chance it could be worse, I don't think it could be worse than what the Pittsburgh Steelers have now got themselves into. And I'm not talking about Justin Fields. So Algier does go, Shawn, in the 1502. He was the next player I was hoping to get, but the next name I would be hoping would be Roschon Johnson that may get back to us. Any other running backs in this range that interest you, intrigue you? Antonio Gibson was somebody who went in the 14th round after we made our selection. Not that I'm looking at him, but somebody who we've talked about in the past seasons. But Roschon Johnson is somebody that I would be interested here if he would make it our way. Which running backs outside of your boy Bucky Irving are we trying to get on this roster?
Well, I mean, I grudgingly put Roschon Johnson into the queue there. The guys I had were Irving, Estime, Shipley, Abanikanda, and Dylan Lauby. I do like those players better. Colm, we could go with Roschon here, but I'm going to make the pitch for Wandale. You make the call.
It's Wandale. Go on. You said to me at the start when I wanted to take Drake London that you want to make picks that are exciting, so you've really put me under pressure to we have to look for some excitement and get Wandale on the roster. Maybe Wandale, Shawn, is the player that it used to always be 13th round KJ Hamler without a doubt. Maybe it's now Wandale actually.
So, Colin, when we were doing our Dynasty Cutdown, so we're going to have a show on that later in the week, do a little Dynasty Reanimators, do a little trade discussion. We had a trade offer come in for Jaylen Warren. The offer was Warren and Gardner Minshew for DeAndre Swift. We did talk about that a little bit on the show, but I'm not against it per se, but you pushed back on it. You said, I prefer just to have Swift. I was certainly fine with that. Then today here, we make the Jaylen Warren pick, and now you're pushing for Swift's backup.
What's going on?
Are you changing the landscape for me on running back with the Chicago Bears?
No, it's a case of, at the cost. And this here is also a little bit of in the situation that we're in at the running back position with the names that are remaining to be available. Obviously, we have some of the rookies in there that are options as well. That one, though, also come down to the roster construction element where I know the discussion we had on Gardner Minshew, but we did get down to the cut downs with some of the trades that were obviously made. We did cut 2 other players, but I felt like we would have been moving him, getting him to cut him, which was part of the kind of equation for myself. I know now that you have Warren moved ahead of Swift, I believe, in your dynasty rankings, which obviously would make that trade straightforward. So I can see where there's a line of confusion, but one is that I'm, building a best ball roster to try and, go with a 0 RB team, and the other one is I think that Swift outscores Warren in the season long. But we also have to build in those contingencies where we know that Swift is somebody who at times has struggled to stay healthy, and that then provides an option for his backup in the 15th round. So that would be more of where I'm coming from there.
So
but it's easy to know that Shawn's not happy
this league, which I think that does make sense. Colm,
Shawn
we are
also
back
not happy that we didn't get Warren in that trade, and we still have Swift. So we'll try and move Swift.
No. I mean, DeAndre Swift is our guy. Colin, Bucky Irving here. Do you have a different running back that you prefer?
Can't overrule you on Bucky Irving, Shawn. Can't overrule you.
So we weren't able to get our first comp to Kyren Williams in Kendre Miller, but we do get Bucky Irving, who has just absolutely insane evasion numbers for the past several years. He's caught a bunch of passes. He is that perfect NFL running back for really any time period, but certainly for the contemporary NFL. The problem, Colm, he's small. He is, at least as a tested athlete, very poor. That type of thing doesn't usually translate to the NFL very well, but we're now getting a huge discount on the actual production, which I like. And I think there's a decent chance we're still going to get a team to take a shot at him. Now, one of the things here is that Kyren Williams didn't do those things as a rookie. If we get the same production that we got from Kyren Williams, then Bucky Irving is useless on a best ball team. But I do like to still add him onto a few of these rosters. Some of the other guys we'd be looking at here would be Estime, who I think probably has a better rookie shot at a specific type of role. I still think that Shipley is kind of the big sleeper, the big breakout candidate. We like Abanikanda late, even though to really hit it would probably require a Breece Hall injury, which would be devastating. Colm, I got my Tez Walker article, long promised, actually up on the site last week. He's somebody who is still available, and that to me doesn't make any sense. He should be going before a lot of these other rookies who are inferior prospects. We also have a situation where Jalin Hyatt is still available. I think that he is a very real breakout candidate in his second season. And then one of the things when we have Wandale, if we were to go the Jalin Hyatt route, I don't mind when we have the 20 rounds to go ahead and add that third QB and Daniel Jones. I can understand how his value would be 0 this year, and yet there are just so many different ways in which Daniel Jones is undervalued by 5-6 rounds. His price doesn't really make any sense unless you're convinced that there's almost no chance that he ends up being the starter for the full season. And then my last guy that I'm looking at here as we kind of plot out our last 4 rounds, Jatavian Sanders. He's going to go earlier than people think in the draft. His combine struggles probably overstated. A prospect who'd be getting a lot more buzz if it weren't for the presence of Brock Bowers, who is just, such a generational force there. Really the tight ends who started going, in round 14 and at the very least in round 15, all of these guys who have gone in the last 3 rounds, which are a lot of tight ends, they should all be going behind it, Jatavian Sanders. Colm, we're on the clock in the middle of round 17. You're up here.
I think with the roster that we have built up here, and mainly because I mentioned earlier about the unknown factors when we get to the NFL draft next week, that they'll not be a race, but they'll be much more clear. Like if Bucky Irving is drafted in the 4th round versus if he goes undrafted, we're going to know different situations there as well. But I think the best time now before the NFL draft is to take shots on these guys, particularly with how we've built out this roster, and aim for the upside scenario of some of these situations. So going that way, I would, when you were mentioning about the 3 quarterbacks, I was thinking at that point that where could we go potentially at the tight end position? I touched on it earlier that I thought it would be a 3 tight end build once we missed out on the likes of Njoku and that. I do think that Dallas Goedert and the range that he's going is maybe one of the other tight ends that allows you to go with a 2 tight end build. So I was going to make the pitch to try and get Sanders on the roster here. But with that, he does go at the 1801. So tight end becomes it's going to be tricky here, Shawn, to get somebody you want on the roster at this point. You've added Zach Ertz to the queue. I think I would quite confidently remove him from the queue. Darren Waller wants to retire. I wouldn't put him in. I'd probably go for one of the rookies again and maybe sin it. Shawn,
Colm, where are we? You're confident that Darren? I mean, it's not
Darren
great
Waller's
when the
not
guy
playing.
obviously wants to retire, but
no.
I mean,
I think we go with.
Is he going to retire?
I don't know. I think we can wait on Senate if you want to take Abanikanda here. It doesn't sound like he wants to play. That would be what I would put it down as. Zach Ertz, did you remove him from the queue or did he get drafted? Which was it?
I removed him. I'm very sensitive to my
Shawn, I don't think I'll ever be able to
wins.
draft. I can't draft Zach Ertz ever again after the situation between the Cardinals, him, and playing over Trey McBride. I've taken a stand there. No, it will never be drafted again by me.
Well, you can take a stand.
I say that joking, but also serious.
He's going to do the same walk 3 yards out, catch the ball and fall down deal for the Commanders this year. I mean, I think the point is
10 catches for
where
14 yards.
Yeah, that doesn't add up to a lot in
tight end premium, though, it can be beneficial.
Points, right?
We've gone off the rails. Zach Ertz has put the show off the rails here. So we do take Abanikanda, Shawn.
We did.
We
did. Abanikanda was a fantastic prospect last year. One of my favorite articles all last season was discussing the pros and the cons of Abanikanda versus Roschon Johnson. It actually got me a little bit more excited for both guys. I think that some of the things that we saw down the stretch from Abanikanda on a handful of carries made him look like a guy who is on the verge of taking it the distance every single play. They're going to come out here with Aaron Rodgers. They're going to move the ball easily. They're going to score a ton of points, and they're going to have to take Breece Hall off the field at times just to get him some rest. And similar to those situations in Green Bay where you have Aaron Jones, but you have the number 2 running back also scoring well, when you get that this season with the Jets, everyone's going to try and figure out why Abanikanda was going in round 18 as opposed to round 12, right? I mean, that is the situation he should be in. That's the price range that he should be in based on the situation and the talent. It's just that we didn't really get to see enough of that last year for people to actually be taking that plunge. Colm, as we do get back around here, it is the right time to go ahead and draft Ben Sinnott, which is, as we teased the other day, probably this year's version of Sam LaPorta. If he's drafted a little bit earlier than people expect, then he's going to rise throughout all of draft season.
Shawn, why did we draft Sam LaPorta in the 3rd round when we could have waited to the 19th round to draft this year Sam LaPorta?
We got both. So we are definitely all set there. Again, Sinnott, a guy tested extremely well at the combine. You go back and look at this most recent season with the Kansas State Wildcats, and he was much more productive and had more multifaceted production, I think, than people realize. He's another player where when you look at his profile and what he does for you structurally and compare that to the receivers at the rookie receivers, right, who have gone from rounds 13 to round 18, you're going to be much better off targeting him than taking a flyer on these receivers who just don't really do anything for you because, their production profiles are not that good. They're not going to go that early. And we're going to see a player or two hit. And yet, why would you take flyers at wide receiver and then mix in all of these tight ends that we know have a super low ceiling as opposed to doing a little bit of the opposite way around? Colm, our running back depth chart now is Warren, Charbonnet, Wright, Lloyd, Irving, Estime, and Abanikanda. Obviously, we've taken a lot of rookies in order to get the wide range of outcomes plays there. When you pull up the players available at running back, I still don't really see that many additional choices for us. We're not super strong at that spot, but as we have one pick left, do you have a specific position? Do you have a player that you love, or do you have a position that you think we need to address?
No, we could have went the route of a 3rd quarterback if we wanted, but I think we can go any direction we want here. We're one pick away from being on the clock. If you have a rookie here, when you're diving really, really deep, that's of interest. Quarterback-wise, it's kind of Nix, but Kendrick Bourne's available, Kenneth Gainwell. There's nothing here of huge excitement. I would rather use this pick again on a upside rookie than anyone else. So I'll let you do the rookie deep dive here and get us a running back.
So we'll go ahead and go with Isaiah Davis there. Somebody who broke a lot of tackles, who was utterly dominant at the small school level. He's one of those players where I think that he could be a surprise day 2 pick, or he could go almost undrafted. When you're talking about running backs who have some questions about the ultimate upside athletically and then haven't played against the top competition, you could see them as real fallers. But Davis has this mix of production and peripherals that a team could also fall in love with and overdraft, especially in this class where he's not really competing with the same level of players he might be in some other instances. He's a guy where, again, if you're going to make a 20th round selection in the week before the draft, go ahead and do it on a guy who could end up jumping 5-6 rounds. There's probably no reason to waste that pick on players who are either going to be completely unaffected by the draft or at this time in 2 weeks will be completely off the draft radar because they were already not really draftable, and then their team added additional people to those depth charts, and then you really don't want them, right? So we're going to go ahead and play our last pick here to help a positional need and also to potentially grab a big riser in about a week's time.
Yeah, and a lot of these players, as Shawn mentioned, at this point, we'll be down to 18 rounds. There'll be some of the rookies, obviously, that go off the board, but there'll be a lot of the veterans that are in that range that just have zero interest in having on rosters. So we do take Davis there. We will run back through the draft. And I think usually we do our quick recap at the end of these, but I think there's enough to talk about with how the draft played out based on some of our early round and mid-round decisions. So I think what we'll do is we'll hold it here. We'll come back with our midweek show as that recap and talk about, I know we're going to talk about my decision to pass on Kenneth Walker. We're going to talk about maybe the Joe Burrow, where we took the quarterbacks. Maybe Shawn will ask me again why we didn't trade for Jaylen Warren in that dynasty trade, but we will go through that on our show later in the week. So make sure you are subscribed to the RotoViz Overtime podcast feed to get that once it is available. That's going to do it for this draft as we finish the 0 RB team, but do come back for the recap because lots of stuff to talk about. My name is Colm Kelly. You can follow me on Twitter at @OverToMarlin. My co-host is Shawn Siegele. Check out all of Shawn's work up on rotoviz.com. And until we are back, have a good one.